Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of your campaign planning course. And in this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of campaign planning. So, what is a campaign? When we talk of communication campaigns in general, we refer to a unifocused communication plan and strategy which has a specific aim, keeping in view a desired target audience. However, when we are talking about communication for development campaigns, it's a little different. So, C4D campaigns generally involve the strategic use of communication to address development problems or concerns and achieve desired development outcomes by engaging with relevant stakeholders. Here, instead of a target audience at whom communication interventions are targeted, we rather have stakeholders or people who have a stake in the process and they partner in the entire communication process so that the development issues or concerns could be appropriately addressed. So, C4D campaigns include basic link steps, which include situation analysis, goal definition, stakeholder definition, communication activities, materials, development of communication materials and products, designing of communication messages, monitoring, and evaluation. So, several basic steps are there, and each of these steps are linked to each other. So, if we try to analyze the role of communication within development initiatives or development projects, uh, we will recall that as part of the modernization paradigm or the dominant paradigm, the role of communication has primarily been that of raising awareness or informing people about project objectives or about desired changes in attitudes or behaviors, trying to persuade people to change their attitudes and to change behavior. So, behavior change has been one of the major aspects or one of the major roles of communication within the modernization paradigm, where communication itself is looked at as a linear, one way, and top down process. And it is assumed that the receivers will read or respond to development messages in the same way as that of development planners. And communication media are viewed merely as agents of change. However, it was soon understood or realized by development planners, particularly communication experts, that communication is neither a one way or a simple process, and uh, one cannot assume that any message uh, which is targeted at specific audiences will lead to a collective change. In fact, development itself is a very complex issue and a complex process, and it often requires broader changes than simply specific change of individual behaviors. So, what becomes important here is to understand uh, that there needs to be a change from media to people, a shift from media centricism to people centricism, a shift from emphasis on products to emphasis on processes. So, as Paulo Mefasopoulos says, media, no matter how technologically advanced, messages, no matter how skillfully packaged, and information, no matter how relevant, are not enough to bring about meaningful and sustainable results. These results can only be achieved if the people involved, that is, the stakeholders, are part of the process leading to change. So, herein comes the importance of people's participation. As he again says, people's participation is or should be the engine of any development initiative. And if people are the engine, communication is the lubricant, allowing the engine to function smoothly so that people are not simply informed but also actively engaged in the decision making process. So, what emerged eventually after realizing the pitfalls of the modernization paradigm was the participatory paradigm, and a new role of communication emerged within this participatory paradigm. So, herein it was understood that the role of communication is much more than the simple transmission or dissemination of information like magic bullets. So, C4D, or Communication for Development, is about using communication to generate new knowledge and consensus in order to facilitate change. It is a form of communication which enables people to have a say. It enables people to participate and develop a sense of ownership for the projects which are being developed for them or are being initiated for bringing about change and development in their lives. So, unless and until we are able to have a consensus of the people in understanding the project objectives and in having a consensus that the project objectives are indeed valid, that change is required in a certain direction, and what kind of direction the change needs to be in. It cannot be done without the understanding and involvement of the stakeholders themselves. So, within this new participatory paradigm, the role of communication assumed a new meaning. So, communication happens both as a dialogic process and as a monologic process. So, communication as a dialogic process is actually what can be called a genuine communicative process, or a communication process which leads to effective use of communication, whereby what we can see are the involvement of listening, exploring, understanding, sharing, empowering people, and building a consensus for change, which can happen only as a shared process. At the same time, it also includes the functions of raising awareness, informing, persuading, and bringing about behavior change. But here, the monologic communication modes and the dialogic communication modes need to work hand in hand to fulfill all of these various roles of communication. So, when we look at things from this perspective, communication for development is not an add-on, but it is a cross-cutting activity in project management. And it is aimed at strengthening dialogue with beneficiaries, with partners and authorities, so that it becomes possible to enhance local ownership of programs and generate a sustainable impact. Very often, when we talk of communication campaign or when we talk of communication interventions, many projects or project planners think of communication as a separate activity, and which is brought in only at a later stage after the planning, the project planning and objective setting and stakeholder identification and things like that have already happened. However, when we think of C4D, it is to be ensured that communication is not used as such an add-on or simply a means to serve the fulfillment of project objectives. But communication becomes a part of the process right from the beginning, right from the project planning up to the monitoring and evaluation process. So, if we now try to understand the campaign planning cycle, and we look at it from a communication for development perspective, then the communication cycle, the communication campaign cycle itself, or the campaign planning cycle itself, becomes a process where communication plays a very important role at each stage. So what we are looking at here is a four-phase campaign planning process, which has been proposed by Paulo Mefalopoulos, which he has called the multi-track communication model. So in this model, he looks at the C4D cycle as a four-phase process. The first phase is the communication-based assessment. So this is basically the situation analysis or the situation assessment phase, but it is not done from the perspective of the development planners alone. And therefore, it is a dialogic process which happens through communication. So communication tools are used in the entire research, in the situation analysis process. So it is also called the community-based assessment because it happens within the community with the involvement of the stakeholders. The second phase is the strategy design phase, where the communication strategy itself is designed, and here both dialogic and monologic methods are used. The third phase is the communication implementation phase, where the communication action plan, which is developed as part of the second phase, which is the strategy design phase, it is actually implemented, and various communication activities are carried out. So this also happens as a combination of dialogic and monologic methods. And the final phase is the communication monitoring and evaluation phase, where the communication strategy implementation process is monitored as well as the end results are evaluated. So if we now look at really what happens in this entire campaign planning process. So we have this campaign framework, which gives you a more detailed understanding about what really happens in each phase. So let us look at this. So what is the first phase? It is communication-based assessment. So this is a phase which involves research, and it provides inputs for the design of the communication strategy. And it is in this phase that the project objectives are defined, refined, and validated. In case project objectives are already present, they get validated through a communication research process. And also the communication objectives are outlined as an outcome of this particular phase. So quite a few things are done as part of the CBA, or the communication based assessment phase. So audiences or stakeholders mapping is done, identification is done, and also we try to analyze the audiences or stakeholders in order to understand their characteristics, behaviors, attitudes, knowledge, practices, etc. Yet another important assessment that happens as part of the CBA is that of risks and opportunities. Are there any kind of political, cultural, or social risks involved, or maybe economic risks involved or technical or technological risks involved in the entire process? Is it going to be feasible, or are there things that need to be preempted in order to ensure project success and sustainability? At the same time, it's important to understand what are the opportunities, what kind of resources are available in the community and with the community, which can be utilized in order to ensure the completion and success of the project. The next is the needs assessment, so that it is possible to understand whether the initiative that is being talked about or thought about is really necessary, is it important, and whether it is required or wanted by the people. So it's important to validate the project objectives through this CBA. Another thing which is explored is solutions along with the people, along with the stakeholders. Possible solutions are explored at this stage. Another thing is the mapping of communication tools and channels and practices, as well as the media channels which are used by the people within the community. So an assessment and mapping of the communication channels is done, and so that appropriate communication practices or communication tools can be identified, which are appropriate to the project objectives. Then, of course, another very important thing that is done within this CBA itself is the setting of indicators for the monitoring and evaluation process. So all of these things, when done, it leads to the uh, setting of objectives or the communication objectives particularly. So the project objectives can be refined and defined as part of this CBA. At the same time, an important outcome of the CBA process is the definition or outlining of communication objectives. The next phase is the strategy design phase. So, strategy design involves transforming the findings of the CBA into usable data, which can inform the design of the effective communication strategy or the design of the communication strategy. So, in this stage, various communication approaches are explored, and an appropriate strategy mix is identified. So, also, what kind of messages are going to become part of this communication strategy, those are also defined. So, the main output of the strategy design phase is the definition of a communication strategy and the preparation of a communication action plan, which outlines the implementation of the communication strategy. So, an outcome of this is the work plan or the communication action plan. Then the third phase of the campaign planning process is the implementation phase. So, in this implementation phase, the messages and materials which are designed as part of the process are designed, produced. They are pre-tested with a small group of people. They are pre-tested, and if any communication activity requires capacity building or training of the people who are involved in the communication process, that is also done, and the message dissemination process happens. So basically, we can say that the communication activities are prepared and executed according to the plan of action. And the fourth phase is the monitoring and evaluation phase. So this phase involves examining two things. One is the process, and the other is the final outcomes of the process. So the monitoring and evaluation indicators, as I've already mentioned, need to be defined right at the onset of the project, and these indicators go as inputs into the fourth phase, which is the monitoring and evaluation phase. So this is the four-phase communication campaign process, which has communication based activities happening right from the beginning of the planning of the project, through a communication based assessment, right up to the monitoring and evaluation phase, which also happens through a communication based process. So this is the campaign planning process, and in this lecture my motive was simply to help you get introduced to the concept of campaign planning and understand or get an idea of this four phase planning process. However, uh, each phase needs to be explained in greater detail uh, over multiple lectures. So we will go on to that eventually. But before that, in our next lecture, we will look at planning models or frameworks which help guide the entire campaign planning process. So thank you so much for listening to me today, and I will see you again soon on coming Monday. Thank you so much.